My wife partnered with a competitor during our separation, hoping to undermine my business. I activated the non-compete clause she had signed years ago. Her new venture collapsed within weeks. She requested a private meeting when investors withdrew funding. "You think I need you to survive?" She said it with her arms crossed and her chin lifted, standing in the middle of the kitchen we had renovated together 2 summers ago. I didn't answer immediately. I just looked at her, and I thought, this is the woman I married 11 years ago in a small vineyard in Tuscany. The woman who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives. The woman who once cried because she found a dying bird in our backyard and insisted we nurse it back to health. I thought, when did she become someone who says things like that? "I never said you needed me," I finally answered. "Good," she said. "Because I don't." She walked out of the kitchen, and I heard the bedroom door close quietly, not slamming, which somehow felt worse. Slamming would have been emotion. That soft click was something else entirely. That was a decision. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. Let me give you just enough context before I get into what happened. I'm 41 years old. My wife, Claire, is 38. We built a mid-sized logistics and supply chain consulting firm together over the course of 8 years. I founded it. She joined me in year 2, took on a leadership role in business development, and over time became the second most recognizable face of the company. We didn't have children. We had the company instead, and for a long time, that was enough. When things between us started unraveling, it wasn't dramatic. It was slow. It was the kind of erosion that happens when 2 people stop being curious about each other and start becoming functional instead. We went from partners to colleagues. And somewhere in that transition, something important got lost. I won't pretend I was blameless. I worked too much. I traveled too often. I missed anniversaries, canceled dinners, and probably said, "I'll make it up to you," more times than I ever actually followed through. But I also loved her. I want to be clear about that. Whatever came after, and a lot came after, I genuinely, completely loved her. That matters because it explains why I was so unprepared for what she did. The separation was mutual in the sense that we both agreed it was happening, but it was her idea first. She brought it up on a Tuesday night in October. She had a glass of wine in her hand and she was standing by the window looking out at the street, and she said, "I think we need time apart." I asked her what that meant. She said she didn't know exactly, just that she felt like she was disappearing, like she had spent the last several years building something that mostly served my vision, and she needed to figure out what her own vision looked like. I told her I understood, which I did, on some level, but I also asked her if she wanted us to go to counseling first. She said she'd think about it. She never brought it up again. 2 weeks later, she asked me if she could move into the guest suite at the back of the house while we figured things out. I said yes. I didn't fight it. I thought giving her space was the right move. I thought, she'll breathe, she'll process, we'll talk, and eventually we'll find our way back. That's what I told myself. And meanwhile, she was already planning something I had absolutely no idea about. The first hint came from my operations director, a sharp and quietly observant man named Derek who had been with me since nearly the beginning. He stopped by my office one afternoon and closed the door behind him, which immediately told me something was off because Derek was not the door-closing type. He sat down across from me. He pulled out his phone and slid it across my desk without saying a word. On the screen was a LinkedIn profile. It belonged to a man named Victor Aldrin. Victor ran a competing firm called Aldrin Meridian, a company that had been trying to break into our territory for the better part of 3 years, with limited success. He was sharp, well-funded, and had a reputation for aggressive acquisition of both clients and talent. I had crossed paths with Victor at industry events a handful of times. He was charming in the way that people are when they've practiced being charming. I looked at the profile, and then I looked up at Derek. "Keep reading," he said. I scrolled down, and there, listed in the recent connections section, was Claire's name. Her new professional profile. Her new title, Strategic Development Partner, Aldrin Meridian. I sat very still for a moment. "When was this posted?" I asked. 2 days ago, Derek said. "But some of our clients have been getting calls from Aldrin reps for about 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I did the math quickly in my head. 3 weeks ago, Claire and I were still technically under the same roof, sharing the same address, eating dinner in the same kitchen on the nights she didn't go out, and she was already working with Victor. Does she have access to any of our current client data?" I asked. Derek hesitated. "She had access to everything," he said carefully. until I quietly restricted her permissions last week when the client call started. I didn't want to alarm you without confirmation. I nodded slowly. Thank you, I said. He nodded back, stood up, and left without another word. I sat in my office for a very long time after that. Here's the thing about building a business with someone you love. You give them access in ways you would never give to a regular employee. Not because you're careless, but because trust, at its deepest level, doesn't come with a contingency plan. When Claire joined the company in year 2, I was careful about documentation. Our attorney had drafted strong internal agreements for all key personnel. Non-disclosure, non-solicitation, and a non-compete clause. Claire had signed it. Not under duress, not without reading it. She had actually reviewed it carefully, made a few edits through her own attorney, and then signed it. It covered a 24-month window post-employment, within a specific geographic region, across a clearly defined list of industry verticals. At the time, she had laughed a little while signing it, and said, "You know I'd never work for anyone else, right?" I had kissed her on the forehead and said, "I know. It's just paperwork." The document sat in our legal files for 7 years. I had genuinely forgotten about it in the practical, day-to-day sense. But it was there, and now I pulled it out. I didn't call Claire that night. I thought about it. I picked up my phone 3 times and put it back down. I needed to think clearly, and I knew that if I called her right then, I would be operating from hurt instead of from strategy, and hurt doesn't make good decisions. I called my attorney instead. His name was Felix, a calm, methodical man in his mid-50s who had been handling my legal affairs for nearly a decade. I walked him through everything. The LinkedIn profile, the client calls, Derek's observations, the non-compete she had signed. Felix listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want to know if it's enforceable?" "I want to know everything," I said. He told me that non-compete clauses had varying enforceability depending on the state, the specifics of the clause, and the circumstances of departure. He said that given the carefully structured language in Claire's agreement, and given that she had exited a senior leadership role and immediately joined a direct competitor within the restricted region and industry vertical, we had an unusually strong case. How strong? I asked. Strong enough that any investor running due diligence on her new venture would have serious concerns, he said. I understood what he was saying. I thanked him and asked him to prepare a formal notice. He asked me if I was sure. Not yet, I said. Give me a week. I spent that week watching, quietly, carefully, and without tipping my hand. Derek kept me updated on client contact patterns. Our business development team flagged 2 clients who had gone unusually quiet after receiving calls from Aldrin Meridian. A former colleague of mine who knew Victor socially mentioned, without knowing the full context, that Victor had been telling people he had brought on a real insider who was going to change their competitive positioning. An insider. That word settled over me like a cold weight. Because that's what Claire was, to them. She wasn't just a talented executive they had hired. She was an asset with institutional knowledge. She knew our pricing models. She knew our client retention strategies. She knew which of our clients were happy and which ones had expressed quiet frustrations. She knew the internal structure that had taken me 8 years to build. And she had walked across the street, so to speak, and handed that knowledge to someone whose entire goal was to dismantle what I had built. I need to be honest with you. There was a part of me that kept trying to find an explanation that made this less intentional. There was a part of me that thought, maybe she was just scared, maybe she panicked, maybe she didn't fully think through what she was doing. But the more I watched, the less I believed that story. This wasn't panic. This was planned. On a Thursday evening near the end of that week, she knocked on my home office door. I said, "Come in." She stood in the doorway, still dressed from what had clearly been a long workday. Fitted blazer, the kind of polished put together that comes with professional confidence. She looked good. She looked like a woman who was energized by something. "We should talk about the house," she said. "Sure," I said. She meant the logistics of the separation. Who would stay, who would go, whether we were going to sell or one of us would buy the other out. I was calm. I asked her how her week had been. She said fine. I asked her if she was still in contact with anyone from our client roster. There was the slightest pause. So slight that if I hadn't been looking for it, I would have missed it entirely. Casually, she said, "Just keeping up with people." I nodded. "Good," I said. I didn't say anything else. She stood there for a moment like she was waiting for me to say something more, and then she said we could talk about the house another time, and she left. I waited until I heard her car leave the driveway before I called Felix. "Send the notice," I said. The formal notice went out the following morning through legal channels. It was addressed to both Claire personally and to Aldrin Meridian as the receiving party. It outlined the non-compete clause in detail. It identified the specific violations, the geographic overlap, the industry vertical, the time frame, and the nature of her current role. It demanded immediate cessation of her work with Aldrin Meridian. It further requested a full accounting of any proprietary information that had been shared. It made clear that failure to comply would result in immediate litigation. Felix told me later that Victor Aldrin's attorney called their office within 4 hours of receiving it. Apparently, Victor was furious. He had not done thorough due diligence on Claire's legal obligations before bringing her on, or if he had gambled that I wouldn't enforce them. He had gambled wrong. I found out about Claire's reaction through an indirect route. Her sister, a woman named Brooke who had always been warm toward me and who I think was genuinely caught between loyalties, called me 2 days after the notice went out. She said Claire was very upset. I said I could understand that. Brooke paused and then said carefully, "She didn't think you would actually do it." I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment. What did she think I would do? I asked. Brooke sighed. I think she thought you'd be hurt, and that would be the end of it. I thanked Brooke for calling, and I thought about that for a long time after I hung up. She thought I would absorb it. She thought I would take the blow, feel the loss, and let it go because confronting her would feel like losing some kind of dignity. She had miscalculated something fundamental about who I was. And more importantly, she had miscalculated something fundamental about what she had actually signed. Victor Aldrin, it turned out, was in the middle of a significant fundraising round. He had been courting a consortium of investors, some regional private equity, some venture-adjacent institutional money, with a pitch that was heavily dependent on his new strategic direction, the direction that Claire was supposed to represent, the insider advantage. The non-compete notice landed in the middle of that process like a brick through a window. Felix kept me updated as information filtered through the legal back and forth. Victor's attorneys argued that the clause was overbroad. Felix's response was meticulous and unhurried. He walked through every specific element of the language and showed exactly why it held up. Victor's side argued that Claire's departure was effectively involuntary given the marital circumstances. Felix pointed out that her departure predated any formal separation agreement, that she had chosen her next role independently, and that the clause made no exception for personal circumstances. Victor's side tried to argue that the information Claire held was general industry knowledge. Felix had Derek prepare a detailed documentation of the specific proprietary systems and client relationship data that fell under our confidentiality agreements. Every argument had a clean counter. Meanwhile, the investors doing due diligence on Aldrin Meridian were getting increasingly nervous. A company built around a key strategic hire who was legally prohibited from performing that role was not an attractive investment. One by one, according to what eventually filtered back through the industry grapevine, the investment commitments began to soften. Then they began to withdraw. I want to pause here and tell you something honest. There was no satisfaction in this for me. I know how this kind of story can read, like the wrong person getting clean, cinematic revenge. But that's not what this felt like from the inside. From the inside, it felt like standing in a building that used to be a home and watching the walls come down piece by piece, and knowing that the demolition was necessary, but still grieving every brick. I had spent 11 years with this woman. I had built something real with her, not just the company, but a life. A language of inside jokes and shared references, and the specific shorthand that you develop when you've lived alongside someone long enough. I missed her, not the version of her that had done this, but the version that I had driven to the hospital at 2 a.m. when she had a severe allergic reaction, the version that had held my hand at my father's funeral and not said a word because she knew words weren't what I needed, the version that had believed in the company when it was 3 people in a rented conference room, and the margin between success and failure was terrifyingly thin. I missed that version, and I was slowly understanding that maybe that version and this version had always been the same person. Maybe I had just chosen to see only what I wanted to see. 6 weeks after the formal notice went out, I received a text from a number I didn't immediately recognize. It said, "It's Claire. I'd like to meet. Privately. Please." She had changed her number at some point during the separation. I stared at the message for a while. Then I replied, "Where and when?" She suggested a restaurant we had never been to together. Clearly deliberate, neutral ground. I agreed to the meeting. I told Felix. He advised me to be careful about what I said and to avoid anything that could be construed as a negotiation or an informal settlement discussion outside of proper legal channels. I told him I understood. I went to the meeting anyway. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a glass of water in front of her and her hands folded on the table. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. There were shadows under her eyes that good concealer couldn't fully hide, and her posture, which was usually effortlessly straight, a habit from years of client presentations, had a slight curve to it, like she was carrying something physically heavy. I sat down. A waiter appeared immediately, and I ordered coffee. Claire said nothing until the waiter left. Then she said, "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I said. She looked at me for a moment. "Victor lost the funding," she said. She said she wasn't asking me to back down completely. She understood the situation had reached a point where some form of formal resolution was inevitable. She was asking if there was a path that didn't require 2 years of expensive, public legal battles. I told her I'd talk to Felix. She asked me one more thing before we left. "Do you think we could have prevented all of this? If we had talked more?" I thought about it honestly. "Maybe," I said. "But I think something had to break before we were capable of having this conversation. I don't know if we would have gotten here any other way." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a sad answer." "Yes," I said. "It is." We left the restaurant separately. I sat in my car in the parking lot for about 20 minutes before I started the engine. In the weeks that followed, there was a formal resolution process. Felix and Claire's attorney worked through the terms. Claire acknowledged the clause violation. A structured settlement was reached that included a supervised wind-down of her involvement with Aldrin Meridian, a formal confirmation that no proprietary systems or client data had been materially transferred in a documentable way, and a series of forward restrictions that were legally binding. Victor Aldrin never made a formal public statement about the collapse of his expansion plans. He moved on, quietly, to other ventures. The consortium of investors that had pulled back from Aldrin Meridian, 2 of them, interestingly, reached out to me within the following quarter. Not solicited, unprompted. They had apparently done their due diligence on the broader situation and concluded that a founder who protected his business architecture with precision was a more reliable counterparty than one who had been caught in a legally compromised situation. One of those conversations eventually turned into something meaningful. But that's a different story. The thing about the divorce, and yes, we did proceed to formal divorce, is that it was less dramatic than everything that had come before it. We had already had the explosion. We had already had the honest conversation. By the time we were sitting across from attorneys in a conference room dividing assets and equity stakes, there was a strange kind of calm over it. Not warmth, exactly, but not hostility either. Something like 2 people who had looked at each other clearly for the first time in years and understood what they were seeing. She received a fair settlement from the company. I made sure of that. Not because I was trying to be generous as a statement, but because her contributions over those years were real, and her equity stake was earned legitimately. The legal resolution around the non-compete was handled separately from the divorce proceedings. Felix was very clear about keeping those threads distinct. On the day we signed the final divorce papers, she and I had a brief exchange outside the attorney's office. She said, "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about Victor." I said, "I know." She said, "Not just for your sake. For mine. It wasn't who I wanted to be." I looked at her. "You were angry," I said. "And you made a decision from anger. It happens." She looked almost surprised that I said that. "You're being kind," she said. "I'm being accurate," I said. She nodded once, and we walked to our separate cars. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Derek a few months after all of this resolved. We were working late one evening, the way we often did, going over projections for the next quarter, the kind of work that doesn't care about personal upheaval and demands your full attention regardless. At some point we took a break, and he poured us both a glass of scotch from the bottle he kept in his office, and he said, without looking up, "You handled that well." I asked him what specifically. He said, "The whole thing. You could have gone after her harder. The clause would have supported more aggressive action. You didn't. Going after her harder wasn't the point," I said. "What was the point?" he asked. I thought about it. "Containment," I said. "Protecting what we built, not punishing her." He considered that. "There's a difference," he said. "There's a significant difference," I said. He nodded and sipped his scotch. "She was good at this job," he said quietly. "Before everything. She was very good," I said. "That must make it worse," he said. "Yes," I said. "It does." We finished our drinks and went back to work. There is a version of this story that is easier to tell. The version where she is simply the villain and I am simply the victim and the non-compete is simply justice. That version is cleaner and more satisfying and takes about 5 minutes to tell. But it isn't accurate. The accurate version is this. Two people built something together and then slowly stopped seeing each other. One of them, me, kept his head down and called it dedication and told himself that the work was proof of love. One of them, her, kept her dissatisfaction quiet and called it loyalty and told herself that the work would eventually be enough. Neither of us was honest in real time. And by the time honesty arrived, it arrived in the wrong form. It arrived dressed as Victor Aldrin and a LinkedIn profile change and a series of client calls that Derek flagged at 4 o'clock on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. I went back to therapy about 3 months after the divorce was finalized. I had been in therapy briefly in my early 30s, and I had found it useful then. I went back now for different reasons. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wanted to understand myself clearly enough to not repeat the same patterns. My therapist, a composed, direct woman named Dr. Weston, asked me in our 3rd session what I thought I had learned from the marriage. I gave her a careful, articulate answer about communication and visibility and the dangers of mistaking professional partnership for emotional intimacy. She listened and then said, "That's the analytical answer. What's the personal one?" I sat with that for a moment. That I was lonely inside a relationship, I said, and I didn't name it. And she was lonely inside the same relationship, and she didn't name it. And we just kept building things around the loneliness instead of addressing it. Dr. Weston nodded. "And what do you do with that now?" she asked. "I try to name things earlier," I said. "Even when it's uncomfortable?" she asked. "Especially then," I said. About 8 months after the divorce, I got a message from Claire. Not a legal communication. Not through attorneys. A personal message. She said she had started her own firm. Something smaller, focused on a niche she had developed expertise in over the years. Supply chain resilience consulting for mid-market manufacturing companies. A space that our firm touched peripherally but didn't specialize in. She said she had been careful about the non-compete boundaries. She had run the scope by her attorney and confirmed there was no conflict. She wanted me to know, not because she needed my approval, but because she didn't want there to be any surprises. I sat with that message for a while. Then I replied, "Thank you for telling me. Good luck with it." She replied back after a few minutes, "Thank you." And that was it. Clean. Bounded. Honest. The way it should have been years earlier. The company had a strong year after all of this. 2 of the clients who had gone quiet during the Aldrin outreach ultimately stayed with us. One reached out proactively and said they had received a call from an Aldrin rep and had declined to engage because of our long relationship. That meant something to me. Not as a business metric, though it was that too, but as evidence that the relationships we had built with integrity over the years were actually load-bearing. They held under pressure. That's not a given. A lot of business relationships are cordial until they become inconvenient. The ones that held through that period of uncertainty were the ones I had invested in genuinely, over time, without a specific transaction in mind. The work of building those relationships had been Claire's domain as much as mine. That's one of the difficult truths I sit with. A lot of what protected the company in that moment was her work, even as she was trying to redirect it toward a competitor. The foundation she had helped pour was what kept the structure standing. I think about that restaurant conversation often. The 2 hours we spent being honest in a way we hadn't managed in years. I think about the specific moment she said she had felt invisible. I've replayed it from different angles. And every time, I arrive at the same place. I didn't make her invisible on purpose. But I created conditions where she could feel that way, and then I didn't pay close enough attention to notice. That's a subtle distinction, but it matters. Intent isn't innocence. Not when the impact is real and the damage accumulates over years. I had told myself I was building something for both of us. But the both of us I was building for was the company version, the professional partnership, the equity structure, the growth trajectory. The actual her, the woman with her own ambitions and her own need for distinct recognition, and her own sense of what success should feel like. I had left that version waiting in the gap between meetings. And she had eventually stopped waiting. There's a moment in every story like this where the person telling it has to decide what the point is. Is the point that loyalty should be legally protected? Is the point that non-compete clauses are worth the paper they're written on when the other party underestimates your willingness to use them? Is the point that business and marriage shouldn't be combined? I don't think the point is any of those things. I think the point is something simpler and less comfortable. People become who their circumstances pressure them to become. Claire became someone capable of partnering with a competitor because the circumstances of our marriage, the invisibility, the dismissal, the accumulated quiet frustration, had formed that version of her. I enforced the non-compete because the circumstances of her action had formed a version of me that had no other viable response. Both things are true at once. And what I've had to learn to live with is the understanding that we shaped each other. Not just in the good ways. In all the ways. The investor conversations I mentioned earlier, the two who reached out after pulling back from Aldrin Meridian, one of them became a genuine business relationship that ultimately resulted in a growth investment in my firm. His name was Qley, a methodical, straight-talking man about 15 years older than me who had built and exited 2 companies of his own. Over the early months of our conversations, he asked me directly what had happened with the separation and the competitor situation. I told him the truth. All of it. Not the clean version. The actual version, including the parts where I had contributed to conditions that made everything blow up. He listened without interrupting, which I had come to recognize as his particular form of respect. When I finished, he said, "Most founders would have told me the version where they were entirely right. I probably was right about the business decision," I said. "But right about the business doesn't mean right about everything." He nodded slowly. "That's a mature answer," he said. "It took me a while to get here," I said. "It always does," he said. We shook hands, and the partnership moved forward. I want to tell you about a specific evening, maybe a year after the divorce, maybe a little more. I was alone in the house, a different house by then. I had sold the one with the renovated kitchen and bought something smaller, cleaner, specifically mine. I was sitting on my back porch in the early evening, the kind of September evening where the air is starting to have that particular quality of the season changing. And I had my phone in my hand, and I was looking at an old photo. Not of Claire and me together. Of the company. The original team. 5 people standing in front of a rented office space on the day we signed the lease. Me, Claire, Derek, and 2 early hires who had since moved on to other things. We all looked young. We all looked like people who had no real idea what they were getting into. And we all looked, genuinely, happy. I looked at that photo for a long time. Not with sadness, exactly. With something more textured than sadness. With the specific feeling that comes from understanding that good things and painful things can have the same origin. That the company and the marriage and the breakdown and the non-compete and the restaurant conversation and all of it, it all started with that same group of people in front of that rented office. The good years made the hard years possible. And the hard years made me someone different. Someone who names things earlier. Someone who pays attention to what people aren't saying, not just what they are. Someone who understands that a legal document is only as strong as the relationships around it, and that when relationships fail, the documents will be tested. I put the phone down. The September air moved through the trees at the edge of my yard, and I sat there for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, just being present in the quiet. There is one more thing I want to tell you. About 6 weeks after the restaurant meeting, while the legal resolution was still being worked out, I was at an industry event, the kind of conference-adjacent dinner that I attended more out of obligation than enthusiasm. I was standing near the edge of the room with a drink in my hand when a woman came to stand near me. Not to talk to me. She was just looking for a quiet edge of the room the same way I was. We stood near each other for a moment without speaking. Then she said, without looking at me, "These things are exhausting." I said, "Every year." She laughed. Her name was Harper. She ran a tech-adjacent operations consultancy that occupied a completely different vertical than mine. We ended up talking for about 40 minutes, and I don't think either of us intended to. We talked about work, about the industry, about the peculiar social economy of events like that one where everyone is simultaneously trying to be genuine and trying to be strategic, and the two things don't always coexist comfortably. She was sharp in a specific way, not aggressive, not performing, just genuinely, quietly sharp. Before I left, she handed me her card. I handed her mine. Neither of us made a specific plan. I thought about calling her a few times over the following weeks, and then the legal situation absorbed most of my attention, and by the time things settled, enough time had passed that reaching out felt awkward. I didn't call, but I thought about the conversation. And later, much later, that thought became relevant in ways I couldn't have predicted that evening. But that, too, is a different story. Here is what I actually learned. Not the business lesson, though there is one. Not the legal lesson, though there is one of those too. The actual lesson, the one that took the longest to arrive at clearly. You can be right and still miss the point. I was right to enforce the non-compete. The clause was valid, her violation was clear, and the business consequences of not responding would have been real and serious. I was right. And also, I had missed the point of my own marriage for years before it reached that moment. I had confused building a company together with building a life together. I had mistaken professional proximity for emotional presence. I had thought that because we were in the same room working toward the same goals, we were actually together in the ways that matter. We weren't. We were two people who had become so fused professionally that neither of us had noticed how far apart we had drifted personally. Until the drift became a chasm. Until the chasm became Victor Aldrin. The company is doing well. Better, honestly, than it was before the disruption. Which is one of the strange and slightly uncomfortable truths of the whole story. The crisis clarified things. It forced me to look at the client relationships, the internal processes, the vulnerabilities in our information architecture. A lot of things that had been vaguely on the list became urgent and got addressed. The company that came out the other side of that year was tighter and more resilient than the one that went in. Derek got a promotion he had deserved for 2 years and that I had kept putting off because there was always something more urgent. 2 new people joined the team who turned out to be exceptional. The partnership with Cole's group opened up a growth trajectory that I genuinely hadn't anticipated. None of that excuses anything that happened. But it is true. Sometimes the things that are meant to break you just make you better at the work. And sometimes the work is all you have left to focus on. So you focus on it, and you let the rest settle. And slowly, over time, it does. If there's someone reading this or listening to this who is in the middle of something similar, I want to say one thing directly. The hardest part is not the legal strategy. The hardest part is not the enforcement. The hardest part is sitting with the knowledge that you loved someone and they hurt you, and you still can't fully reduce them to the worst thing they did. Because they are more than the worst thing they did. And so are you. That complexity doesn't resolve. It doesn't get tidied up into a clean moral. You just have to learn to carry it. To let it inform how you pay attention going forward. To let it make you someone who asks harder questions earlier, who listens for what's underneath what's being said, who understands that the people closest to you are also the people most capable of both profound support and profound damage. Not because they're villains, but because intimacy works in both directions. I still have the photo, the one from the rented office. I moved it from my phone to a small frame. It sits on my desk at the new office. Not as nostalgia, not as a wound, as a reminder that everything starts smaller than it becomes, and that the people who stand with you at the beginning shape the shape of everything that follows, even when they're no longer there. Especially then. The last time I heard anything about Claire indirectly, through a mutual acquaintance at an industry gathering, was a brief mention that her new firm had landed its first significant client. I heard that, and I felt something uncomplicated and genuine. I was glad. Not because of what we had been to each other. Not despite it. Just glad. Which is maybe what resolution actually looks like. Not closure. Not absence of feeling. Just glad.